Hey everybody, Aaron Counts, Sage Dynamics. This video we're going to talk about maneuvering the rifle around cover, concealment, and barricades. What we're ultimately talking about is maneuvering the rifle around objects, be they cover, concealment, or barricades. And each object is obviously going to have a different purpose based on what it's made out of and how useful it is to you. Now, there's two general categories of objects in this world, cover, if you will, concealment, or barricades, if you will. There's linear and non-linear. A linear object is something that's only going to work in probably one, potentially two directions. It's going to be, for the purposes of cover, one-dimensional. Say, the corner of a building. If it's only going to work in this direction, even though the building is three-dimensional, it's only working in the direction of the threat. So using another side of it just isn't really reasonable unless something changes. Non-linear objects such as vehicles, large jersey barriers, anything that can be quickly maneuvered around but can be used from any side as cover moves or attempts to flank, or as your threat moves or attempts to flank you, is a much more advantageous position of cover or concealment. You think about the traditional trench. Well, trenches only really work in one direction, and once you're flanked, the trench ceases to be functional or effective. Same thing with the ditch beside the road, or even small three-dimensional objects such as telephone poles. They may not be usable in the three-dimensional, and that's really, if we have our choice when it comes to cover, that's what we want. That doesn't really change for most objects how we're going to maneuver the rifle around them, but it's definitely something to consider when you're thinking about how you practice. Everybody's probably familiar with something like this. We've talked about it in videos before. Your notch wall, your slat wall, your barricade. These are awesome, but they don't necessarily reflect what you're going to find in real life. If you think about what you have just in your general vicinity, think about within 3 miles of your own home, do you have a lot of stuff that's going to provide the same amount of coverage that you're going to get from this wall? The answer is probably no, outside of, say, a brick building or a cement building, cinder block, something like that. Generally, what's alongside your roadsides or in your urban areas, not really going to give you the same degree of cover as this was. Now, concealment, different story. There's all kinds of objects. Generally, they're going to give you as much concealment as you can get from this. But this is a good training aid to isolate the skill set of maneuvering the rifle around cover and concealment. It's a good place to start. My personal feeling is start with something like this and then work your way towards the most possible smallest object you could potentially get at least the vital areas of your body behind. Best practices to use the rifle around cover, concealment, barricades, and the light. Generally, we want to push the light past the object that we're going to be using. Reason for that? Pretty simple. There's going to be backsplash. If I turn on my light and it hits this object before I'm able to lean out, that illuminates me to whatever's potentially on the other side of this object. Generally speaking, cover and concealment are infinite, meaning if I can get myself and get that object between me and my potential threat or my known threat, then it's working. Of course, it works both ways. If it's going to be cover from one side, it's going to be cover from the other. Pretty common sense. The hardest thing to do really is get into a general practice of being able to consistently push your light past that object when you're able to do it. Not every situation it's going to make sense to push your light past the object you're working, and we'll get to that. My general practice on something like this is, originally I learned a barrel bump. We'd come forward and you'd bump the barrel and know, okay, I've made contact, that's the maximum length of my rifle. I know when I lean out, I need to push a little further forward. That works. That is one option that you have. Me personally, I like to come in at kind of almost a 90 degree and hit right here. So now I know when I punch out, I'm going to be past that object, or at least get the light past this edge every single time. Again, if this is the leading corner of a wall, and your weapon light is at the 12, the 6, or on the inside, or even to some degree on the outside on this 3 o'clock for this right side exposure, that light is still going to be saturating that side of that wall, so it's going to telegraph your location back. And that's one of the things about working interior, like working down a hallway or something like that, is even if you get really, really far out, depending on your light positioning, the light can still telegraph the location of the firearm. That's really important if your observer, be it your threat or your unknown, is not directly down the bore of your rifle, but off to the right or off to the left or somewhere off position. The brighter your light, more candela you're pushing down range, the less likely they are to specifically pinpoint your location. This is something you can try for yourself with an extremely bright flashlight. Go down, get into a hallway, grab a buddy, one of your shooting partners, go into a doorway and shine in whatever ambient low light conditions you want. Work from dark up to brighter conditions. The brighter the light, the better. You'll find when you shine it down that hallway, he can't really pinpoint the actual source of the light. All he's really going to see is just a giant starburst of light. The brighter the light, the more candela, and the closer he is to the light, the worse it's going to be. So While it is true that a threat will shoot at the source of the light, it's going to be very hard for them to pinpoint a specific point of aim in a more less sterile environment. Most people are going to be right-handed, so they're going to shoot the rifle in the right shoulder. We'll get to a left side exposure working less than ideal cover concealment barricade. But the concept remains the same. Whether you come in muzzle up or muzzle down, depending on the situation, depending on the environment, you should definitely know how to do both. Let's say just coming in muzzle up or muzzle down. The biggest problem I've seen with students with muzzle down is they tend to come in muzzle down and get too close to the object. And then when it's time to come up and work the rifle out, they're putting themselves in a less stable stance as they come back and lean back, and then they got to rework their footwork, and they tend to illuminate themselves or not press the rifle far enough past the object in order to make it efficient. That's one of the biggest problems with negotiating cover when it comes to muzzle down. I'm not a huge muzzle down fan once we get into actually working cover concealment. It's easy to switch. You can make that mental switch in your head. Okay, before I was working muzzle up, now I'm going to work muzzle down. Before I was working muzzle down, now I'm going to work muzzle up. Based on the environment that you're in, one or the other might make sense. There is no one true safe muzzle position because situations constantly change. People get into that range mentality of trying to keep it pointed at the dirt or pointed it at the berm, and that's fine for the range. If your range requires that, totally understand. If you think about working outside of those environments, if you've got small kids in the house, muzzle down might not be the best default position for you. If you live in a second-story house and you're worried about working on the first floor, you might want to think about maybe muzzle up isn't the best position for you. So the situation can change pretty dramatically, pretty consistently. That's why it's a good idea to not get married to one specific muzzle position. But getting back to it, if I come in at a muzzle up position, I may have the same problem. I can get too close and have that impact. And that's why for me, it's kind of hardwired to come in. Once I get ready, I'm going to set and bump. That way, when it's time to go to full extension, I know that the rifle is going to go at least past that leading edge every single time. Just a different view, really quick, kind of a close-up view of the technique. I can stay in shoulder and do that barrel bump. I can come in and make contact. Now I know I have to lean out and I have to press forward a little bit, which may, again, cause a stability problem. So for me, it's just as simple as bringing the stock out of pocket. So I have a little bit, the rifle sits back into the body a little bit further forward. So now when I press and then when I come back into shoulder, it pushes the rifle out to its natural position, which is going to get the muzzle just past the object. Again, this is, to me, the most basic level of safe operation for the technique. Obviously, I can exaggerate and push the rifle even further past. Once I get here and bump, okay, now I go to full extension, I can then dig in even further, especially if I'm going to say use the barricade for support or something like that. But it at least gives me the option to know, okay, my light is going past that immediate edge. With a handgun, obviously this is more exaggerated. If you remember from the hand video, we talked about this coming in at that 90 degree. So then, I'll do it right-handed, coming in at that 90 degree. So then when I punch out, I know definitively it's going to be past because the gun is making contact in the preparatory position much further back from the object. But the same concept applies. Now we get to the dreaded left side exposure. Most shooters are going to be right-handed. That's just a thing. So they're going to shoot the rifle from the right shoulder. So they're going to be, well, they're going to prefer those right side exposures. Any nonlinear object is going to have at least 2 vertical exposures and probably ability to shoot over the top, and especially with these barricades, these things that we use to simulate these cover and concealment objects, they have multiple different angles that you can use, multiple different sides you can use. When it comes to transferring the rifle over to the leading edge of the body to minimize exposure to the threat, which is the whole reason we're doing it, there's 2 techniques. There's bumping over, and then there's full transfer of control. I prefer bumping over because I'm probably not going to be using that left side exposure for a long period of time, and I'm pretty comfortable and competent in the technique. But setting up for it remains the same. I'm still going to get that initial press, that stock tucked, so I know when I go full extension I'm out there. And then at that point, I will bump the rifle over to the left shoulder, and now my light is past that initial leading edge. I'm able to get my engagement, pick up my optic with my left eye. Some people are uncomfortable with that technique because it just doesn't feel right. It does feel very foreign when you start using it, but it is extremely fast. it's much faster. It's almost always, I could say safely, almost always going to be faster than transferring control of the rifle completely over to the left side of your body. There's more movement involved in that, and it takes you longer to go to left and then back to right, and then you've got sling management issues, and you could probably have gear hang-up issues, and any number of other things that can happen. Doesn't mean you shouldn't know how to do both techniques or practice both techniques, but for the sake of speed, bumping over is generally going to be the faster technique. If I'm going to hand over complete control, I'm going to prep first. And then if I have to swim out of my sling, that's what I'm going to do. Bump the rifle over, transfer controls, and now when I come up and press past, the light is still past that leading edge. As with all things, there's exceptions to every rule. When we talk about working low light in regards to cover concealment, we get into a situation where we're going to have two very wise techniques that come into direct disagreement with each other. And that is push the light past the cover to avoid backsplash, avoid self-illumination, and then we're going to have the concept of slicing or pieing angles, and the fact where we don't want to suck up to the object and push our weapon past it, because that telegraphs our location, our intentions, our movement, and it allows for any potential threat to have a more easy time of identifying our location and our intentions. So if this is my doorway and I'm going to use that traditional technique of working the angles, and I'm digging this corner, seeing as much as I can, and then I'm going to slowly work around. If I'm keeping my light past that the entire time, illuminating as I go, then obviously that's going to create significant issues with my own personal safety, because I'm telegraphing my location, my intentions, and I'm pushing my weapon into the room, which is generally considered to be a pretty big no-no. That's not something we want to do. When we get things off of the range and we start thinking about them as they apply to the real life, this is where situations like this develop. These two techniques are in direct competition with each other, and you have to decide which one is going to take precedence given the environment that you're in. I'm not going to say that you have to pull back and work a wide angle. I'm also not going to say that you wouldn't necessarily push your weapon light past the object based on the circumstances. And this isn't just talking about doors. This is talking about any angle whatsoever that you have to negotiate. It doesn't make sense to work angles from this close if you can avoid it. And generally, we can avoid it using certain practices. When I think about using light for self-defense, I'm thinking about looking for people-sized objects. So if there is enough general illumination in the low-light environment to at least physically make out a human person, then I may not use my light. Now, if I identify, okay, I can see a person in the corner, I can't really make them out very well, at that point I would activate my weapon light, because positive identification of our threat is something that we have to do before we engage. But that doesn't necessarily mean I have to use the light every single time. Because we're diurnal by nature, we're daytime predators, we tend to want to illuminate stuff. And we might not necessarily have to. I mean, we have very, very poor night vision compared to most of the animal kingdom, especially mammals. They have that cool tapetum lucidium in their eye that allows double charging of light as it comes in, so they have much better night vision. That's why animals' eyes shine in the dark when you shine light into them, because they have that adaptation that we just, for some reason, we weren't on the list of people to get that. And that's okay, because we invented night vision, and that's cool. But in this situation, I have to decide which technique is going to take precedence. If you think about coming from a lit room into a dark room, we're at a significant disadvantage, because anybody inside can see us very well, and us out here, we can't see very well into a dark room from a very well lit room. In that situation, using the light may take precedence, because you at least have to give yourself some kind of advantage that you wouldn't otherwise have, and you have to illuminate the room, and that's just going to have to be a thing. Sure, you could reach in there and find a light switch if a light switch exists, and that's definitely something that would be a totally different topic for debate on whether you should be using light switches or not, and in which situations you should and which situations you shouldn't. Now, if we're working from a dark room into a lit room, we almost have the advantage because we don't really need the weapon light. The truth is somewhere in the middle. When we start talking about ambient lighting conditions, if the ambient light is good enough for you to navigate and for you to at least generally identify the shape of a person-sized object, then maybe you shouldn't be so hot on the light switches. If that isn't the case, then maybe the light needs to take precedence over the generally accepted practice of keeping off as far off as you can, 3 to 6 feet, so to speak, textbook definition, when you're slicing the pie or working angles or what have you. Really, the last thing to talk about, and it's just kind of worth mentioning, is light controls, mounting position should be as body neutral as possible. especially pressure pads. Most people I see, you know, if they've got the rail space available, 12 o'clock seems to be a really good place to place it. And the reason for that is pretty self-evident when we start talking about working cover, concealment, and barricades. The fact that I can activate the light from either side of the body, I can transfer control over and still be able to get to my light source. I also like pushing the light as far forward for a number of reasons as possible. One of the reasons is so it clears my pad, so then I'm not coming across the light body itself to get to my pressure pad, if the weapon allows that. Some people like to keep their muzzle further back because they don't want it to come in contact with their muzzle device, which, you know, for a lot of situations, if you can do that, that makes a lot of sense. Like this particular rifle does sit a little bit further back because this is a 14-inch gun, 14.5 plus the length of the muzzle device, so 16.1, I think. Generally, on my shorter guns, I tend to run them completely suppressed. I keep the suppressor on there at all times, so then it doesn't really become an issue where my light's mounted in relation to the muzzle device, because it's not going to be mounted so far forward that it's past the end of the suppressor, so that's not that big of a deal. So when you're setting up your gun, especially your home defense or your patrol gun, think about, can I activate my controls easily from both sides of the body in the event that I have to deal with this situation? Just anecdotally from my own personal experience, what I've seen with people who use rifles is if they're not comfortable using left side exposures, if they're a right-handed shooter, be it bumping over or transferring control completely, they're not going to do it. And because of that, they have a greater chance of self-illumination under low light conditions, or causing them to shoot from a very unstable position because they didn't properly set themselves before they tried to lean out. If I'm using a left side exposure with a right shoulder, I have to lean out much further to actually get my gun in the fight, so to speak. And that can cause stability issues. So that's definitely something to consider. What's driving you? How much of a hurry are you in? When you work on it in your own personal practice, there's probably nothing real world that's causing you to rush. So take your time and work on building the foundations of the technique before moving past that. There's not a lot of magic when it comes to working cover concealment under low light, but it does take a while to get proficient with it. So I wanted to put this video out and the previous one we talked about handgun specific and low light in hopes that it can give you some things to think about or some new things to try to increase your skill set. I'm Aaron Count with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.